The day began like any other at Hollow Creek. Boots echoed softly in dark tunnels, headlamps cutting through the cold, damp air. Men moved with familiar rhythm, voices low and steady, the hum of machines fading into the background. Then something shifted, a silent tension in the air, a breath held too long. Fingers reached out, grabbing a phone, pressing buttons. The fragile connection flickered to life, holding for a brief moment. That moment was the last. After that, silence swallowed the mine. Hey, it's Nina. Today we're diving into a story that started on February 13th, 1982, deep inside a small mining town called Hollow Creek. It was just another day for the miners working the last shift of the mine's operation. But something happened underground that day. Something the town still remembers, quietly, decades later. Hollow Creek wasn't much to look at. Nestled in the mountains, it was a place where the mine dictated life. Long days, cold nights, tight communities built on hard work and quiet endurance. No one expected that last shift to turn into anything other than routine, but it did. Hollow Creek was the kind of place you could miss if you blinked. Tucked away deep in the rugged mountains, it was a town built not on fame or fortune, but on necessity, on the back-breaking labor of the miners, who worked the veins of coal buried beneath the earth. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, your history, and the silence that stretched between the houses told stories just as loud as any words. The town itself was a cluster of weathered wooden homes. Their paint faded from years of wind and cold. Dirt roads wound through the settlement like tired veins, patched with gravel and riddled with potholes. On any given morning, the smell of wood smoke hung low, mixing with the crisp mountain air. Kids in patched jackets chased one another past the general store, where the bell above the door jingled every time it opened. And old men sat on porches sharing stories that had been told 1,000 times, but never lost their weight. The mine was the heart of Hollow Creek, and it was all anyone really talked about. It was a place where the clock wasn't just a timekeeper, but a heartbeat. Shifts ran long and hard, often stretching beyond the official hours, with the men descending into the darkness while the sun barely peeked over the mountain ridges. The work was dangerous, grueling, and unforgiving. Every miner carried a blend of pride and quiet fear, knowing that the mountain could take everything with a single tremor or collapse. Winter in Hollow Creek was brutal. Snow blanketed the ground for months, turning the dirt roads into slick, icy traps. Inside their homes, families huddled around small stoves, trying to shake off the chill that crept into their bones. The isolation tightened the bonds between neighbors. People leaned on each other, shared what little they had, and kept their worries behind closed doors. Life in Hollow Creek was slow but steady. Mornings started early with the rattle of old pickup trucks gathering men at the mine entrance. The men came down from the hills, faces flushed from the cold, hands calloused and cracked from hard work. They wore heavy boots and patched overalls, helmets with lamps balanced on their heads, and a kind of determination etched into every line of their faces. There was a routine to it all, a rhythm born from years of repetition. The same route through the tunnels, the same sounds of picks striking rock, the same worn paths where generations had passed. The miners were a tight-knit crew, bonded by shared risk and unspoken understanding. They carried stories of close calls and lost friends, but those tales were told in hushed tones, the kind of things you didn't speak of lightly. Most days, they joked and teased each other to break the tension. Others sat quietly, eyes distant, waiting for the shift to end. In town, the families waited. Wives, husbands, children, and parents carried the weight of the unknown with every passing hour underground. Margaret, the wife of Tom, the shift supervisor, rose before dawn to prepare breakfast and pack his lunch, the clatter of pots and pans echoing softly in the kitchen. She kept her eyes on the clock, counting down the hours until his return. The tension that lived in the shadows of the mine found a home in her chest, a tightness she never named aloud. Despite the dangers, Hollow Creek had its small comforts. Friday nights meant a visit to the local bar, where the men gathered to share a drink and forget the darkness below. Sunday afternoons brought church services and potluck dinners, moments of warmth in a hard life. Children attended a one-room schoolhouse, their laughter bouncing off the faded walls as teachers tried to keep their attention focused on lessons about a world much bigger than the mountains. But beneath the routine, there was an unspoken tension. The mine's walls seemed to hold secrets, creaks and groans that didn't quite fit the ordinary. Equipment sometimes malfunctioned without explanation. Shadows lingered a little longer in the corners of the tunnels. Some men whispered of strange noises far underground, sounds that couldn't be traced to any machine or falling rock. No one talked much about it outside the mine, and even inside, those who noticed tried to shrug it off. This was Hollow Creek. Danger was part of the job. You learned to live with it or you left. As February deepened, the days grew colder, the snow thicker, and the mountain seemed to watch with an indifferent silence. It was in this harsh landscape, where nature was as unforgiving as the work itself, that the last shift was about to begin. Hollow Creek was more than its weathered buildings and winding dirt roads. It was the people who lived there, the ones who showed up day after day, shifting between hope and hardship, shaping the town's quiet pulse. Among them, a few stood out not because they were heroes or legends, but because their lives would soon be intertwined with the night the mine went silent forever. Tom Reynolds was the shift supervisor that day, in his early 40s, with hands hardened by decades underground and a face that seemed carved from stone. He carried the weight of the mine on his shoulders. To many, he was a steady presence, calm, reliable, and pragmatic. But behind his steely gaze was a man who knew the fragility of life beneath the earth. Tom wasn't a man of many words. He preferred action, and his crew respected him for it. He had risen through the ranks slowly, earning trust not by talk, but by proving he could handle the worst the mountain threw at him. Tom's wife, Margaret, was the other steady force in town. She was a woman shaped by the harsh winters and long absences of her husband, a patchwork of strength and quiet worry. At home, she held the fragile balance between hope and fear, preparing meals and managing the household alone when Tom was deep in the tunnels. Margaret had learned to hide her anxiety behind a calm exterior, but the weight of every shift hung heavy on her shoulders. A constant presence she never spoke of outside the walls of their small house. Among the crew, there was Eddie, the older miner with a weather-beaten face and a voice rough from years of shouting over machinery. He was known for his dark humor and stubborn streak, but also for the way he looked out for the younger men, especially Danny. Eddie had been through close calls and knew the mountain's moods like an old friend. He carried stories from shifts long past, tales that echoed through the cold tunnels when the lamps flickered low. Then there was Danny Collins, barely 22, fresh to the crew, but eager. Danny was the youngest miner on that last shift, a kid from a nearby town who had come to Hollow Creek chasing steady work and a chance to prove himself. His face was still smooth, unmarked by the dirt and grit that coated the others. There was a nervous energy about him, a mix of excitement and unease that came with stepping into a world where danger was the norm and mistakes could be fatal. He was the kind of guy who asked questions, who noticed things other men ignored. Danny looked up to Tom as a mentor, hoping to learn everything he could about the mine, before the mountain took it all away. The miners worked as a unit, a team forged by the unrelenting demands of their job. They shared a language of nods, brief exchanges, and looks that spoke volumes beneath the surface. Each man carried his own history, losses, hopes, secrets, but underground, those things didn't matter as much as staying alive. Back in town, other faces circled around the mine, tied to it by blood and marriage. There was Sarah Mills, the local nurse, whose shifts often overlapped with the miners' work hours. She had grown up in Hollow Creek and knew every family's story, their scars and their quiet fears. Sarah was the one called when accidents happened, when someone didn't come home on time, or when the mountain's cold hand touched a life. The mayor, Harold Green, was a practical man, more concerned with keeping the mine running than chasing rumors of strange noises or malfunctions. He saw the mine as the town's lifeblood, its future wrapped up in coal and sweat. Harold was the man who balanced hope and desperation, knowing that shutting down the mine would mean the end of Hollow Creek itself. And there were countless others, wives waiting in kitchens, kids running down snowy roads, old-timers watching from porches, each one part of the fabric that made Hollow Creek more than a dot on a map, but a community shaped by the mountain's shadow. The characters of Hollow Creek were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Their lives were about to be marked by something none of them expected, a night that would change everything, and leave a silence deeper than any mine shaft. For the men of Hollow Creek, life revolved around routine. Each day folded into the next like the rock layers deep beneath their feet, steady and unchanging, until it wasn't. Morning started early. Long before dawn, the miners gathered at the edge of town. They climbed into battered trucks, their breath clouding in the cold air. Jokes mixed with cigarette smoke as the vehicles rumbled toward the mine entrance, the wheels crunching on frozen gravel. Inside the mine, time slowed. The only markers were the clink of tools against stone and the flicker of headlamps illuminating the rough walls. The scent of wet earth and metal hung heavy. Work was monotonous but dangerous, an endless task of digging, hauling, shoring up tunnels. Tom Reynolds was always first to arrive. His steady presence set the tone for the crew. He checked equipment, scanned the faces of the men, and made sure every safety protocol was followed. No detail was too small when your life depended on it. Danny Collins, new to the job but quick to learn, shadowed Tom as best he could. He asked questions and absorbed advice, all while keeping a wary eye on the shifting shadows and unexplained noises. Some older miners dismissed as tricks of the mind. Despite the camaraderie, there was an undercurrent of unease. Equipment sometimes failed without clear cause. The air would grow inexplicably colder in certain sections of the tunnel. Whispers of strange sounds, scraping, breathing, distant footsteps, surfaced quietly among the crew. But the mine was their livelihood, and most chose to ignore the warnings or chalk them up to stress and fatigue. The shift wore on with the usual rhythm, digging, hauling, shouting over machinery. Lunch breaks were short, often eaten in cramped underground rooms. Miners exchanged stories, some lighthearted, others dark. Eddie, the oldest of the crew, shared tales from decades past, his gravelly voice filling the space. His stories reminded everyone that the mountain demanded respect, that luck was never guaranteed. Meanwhile, back in Hollow Creek, life carried on under the looming shadow of the mine. Margaret prepared meals alone, her hands steady despite the worry threading through her thoughts. Neighbors exchanged greetings at the general store, their smiles masking the weight of waiting. Sarah Mills, the nurse, kept the clinic ready, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. At town meetings, Mayor Green pressed for productivity, downplaying concerns about safety. The mine was the town's heart, and to many, its only hope. Shutting it down meant losing everything. The days leading to February 13 had been colder than usual, the snow heavy and relentless. The mountain felt different, quieter in a way that unsettled even the most hardened miners. Some had mentioned seeing shadows where none should be, hearing noises just beyond earshot. Yet the work went on. That last morning, the men stepped into the tunnels with practiced calm, unaware that the day would break the rhythm forever. It was routine, until it wasn't. The last shift began under a gray sky, the mountain wrapped in cold silence that felt heavier than usual. The men filed in like they had countless times before, tools in hand, lamps flickering against the cavernous dark ahead. Tom led them down the winding tunnels, voices steady but tinged with an unspoken edge. As they went deeper, the familiar sounds, picks striking stone, the rumble of distant machinery, grew faint, swallowed by the weight of the earth pressing in. The air thickened, colder than the winter outside, every breath a visible cloud in the beam of their lamps. Shadows flickered at the edges of vision, a darkness that seemed to move with a life of its own. Danny's steps faltered for a moment when he caught something, a whisper, a scraping noise just beyond the light. He glanced back, catching Tom's eye, who nodded, signaling to keep going. The mine had its tricks. Nerves could play cool games, but this wasn't nerves. Minutes passed, and the radio in Tom's hand buzzed, crackling with static, then silence. They tried to reach the surface, but only broken fragments of sound came through. Whispers, scratches, a voice, too faint to understand, but heavy with fear. Suddenly, a distant rumble shook the tunnel walls. Dust fell from the ceiling, pattering like rain on helmets. The men tightened their formation, voices low and urgent. Tom's grip on the radio tightened as the signal flickered back, carrying a single chilling phrase before cutting out completely. Get out, now. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Lights flickered wildly. Shadows lengthened and twisted, moving just beyond the reach of their lamps. Danny's heart pounded in his chest as the air grew oppressive, thick with something unseen. Panic was a distant echo. Survival instinct surged forward. One by one, the crew stopped responding. Calls went unanswered. Footsteps faded. The mine swallowed them whole. The last thing anyone outside heard was the faint click of a phone being grabbed, fingers trembling as they reached for connection, a fragile lifeline in the overwhelming dark. That signal held for a heartbeat, then vanished. What happened next is a silence heavier than any rock. When the men failed to check in after the last shift, panic rippled through Hollow Creek like wildfire. The silence from deep inside the mine was deafening. Phones rang unanswered. Radios crackled dead air, and every minute stretched like an eternity. Families clung to hope while the town's nerves frayed. Authorities quickly organized search parties. Miners who had come out early, familiar with the tunnels, teamed up with rescue workers equipped with the best gear available in 1982. They descended into the darkness, flashlights slicing through the black, their boots echoing in narrow corridors carved by decades of toil. The initial search focused on the main shafts and known fault lines, the places most prone to collapse. Every creak and groan of the mountain set nerves on edge. But the deeper teams went, the more the mine seemed to resist, passages blocked, equipment mysteriously malfunctioning, and unsettling silence replacing the usual hum of life underground. Radio contact was spotty. Sometimes a voice would break through, distorted and faint, only to be swallowed by static. Those moments raised hope, then crushed it again. Families waited on the surface, faces pale, eyes wide with fear. Margaret Reynolds clutched the phone tightly, replaying the last moment she'd heard from Tom's shift. Fragments of static, whispered warnings, and then nothing. In the dim light of their small home, she waited, each tick of the clock echoing the weight of uncertainty. The town's nurse, Sarah Mills, coordinated medical support and counseled the anxious families. Her calm presence was a fragile anchor, but even she couldn't hide the strain. Local law enforcement and mine officials combed through logs and equipment records. They scoured for clues, any sign of what had gone wrong. Reports of strange noises and equipment failures were suddenly pulled from the margins, examined under a harsher light. Was it coincidence, mechanical failure, or something else entirely? Mayor Harold Green faced mounting pressure to explain the delay, the silence, and the lack of clear answers. His focus on keeping the mine operational was tested against the growing fear that something more dangerous lurked beneath the surface. Days passed with no breakthrough. Search parties pushed further, their progress slowed by collapsed tunnels and dangerous air pockets. Some miners refused to believe the worst, holding on to faith that their friends would walk out. But the mountain held tight. The mine swallowed their calls and their footsteps, leaving only unanswered questions. When the search finally ended, Hollow Creek was left hollow in more ways than one. No bodies, no survivors, and no clear answers. The mine was sealed off, its tunnels sealed with heavy steel doors and concrete walls, locking away the mystery and the memories. Families who had clung to hope were forced to face silence. Margaret Reynolds sat alone in the cold house she shared with Tom, the empty chair at the kitchen table a constant reminder of what was lost. The town's routine shattered, replaced by whispered rumors and haunted glances. Life in Hollow Creek slowed to a crawl. The local bar closed its doors. The schoolhouse saw fewer children as families moved away, searching for fresh starts. The mountain stood silent, indifferent to the grief etched into its shadow. Media reports arrived sporadically. A few scattered articles mentioned the disappearance, but the story quickly faded from headlines, buried under other tragedies. The official investigation remained inconclusive. No cause determined, no fault assigned. Yet the town talked. Stories circulated of strange noises echoing from sealed tunnels, lights flickering in abandoned shafts, shadows moving where none should be. Some said the mountain had claimed what it wanted. Others whispered about old curses and restless spirits. Sarah Mills, the nurse who had comforted so many, began to notice changes in those left behind. Anxiety turned to obsession for some. Dreams gave way to nightmares, and a palpable fear lingered like a second skin. The mayor faced mounting criticism, but maintained a stoic front, insisting the mine had been a risk all along. Yet even he avoided the tunnels now. Despite the passage of time, the disappearance remained a wound in Hollow Creek's history, a scar beneath the surface that never fully healed. Over the years, as official explanations faded, Hollow Creek's story gave rise to theories that ranged from the plausible to the downright strange. With no clear answers, people tried to fill the silence with possibilities, some grounded, others speculative, all tinged with the unknown. One of the most common ideas was simple mechanical failure. Mines are dangerous places, prone to collapses, gas leaks, and equipment breakdowns. Some experts argued that a sudden cave-in or toxic gas release could have trapped the miners or forced them deeper into inaccessible tunnels. The lack of bodies or signals might be explained by the mountain's shifting earth swallowing evidence, making rescue impossible. Others looked to the psychological toll. Shared stress, fatigue, and isolation underground might have contributed to confusion or mistakes. Some suggested a form of collective panic, causing the crew to become disoriented or separated in the labyrinthine tunnels. This theory points to the brutal conditions and mental strain, rather than anything supernatural. But the town's whispers often ventured beyond logic. Some residents believe the mine sat atop a thin place, a spot where reality blurred, where time and space behaved strangely. Stories told of strange lights flickering deep underground, of shadowy figures glimpsed in peripheral vision, and of sounds that no machine could make. A few old-timers spoke of legends passed down, warnings ignored by those hungry for coal and work. There was talk of unexplained equipment failures happening just before the disappearance, as if the mine itself was resisting the miners' intrusion. Some theorized a hidden fault line, or a cavern filled with an unknown force that disrupted radios and navigation. Psychics and paranormal investigators were occasionally drawn to Hollow Creek, drawn by the mystery and tragedy. They spoke of restless spirits, energy trapped by trauma, or an ancient presence guarding the mountain. These ideas remained on the fringes, dismissed by skeptics, but embraced by those desperate for answers. Even with the many theories, none fully accounted for the strange details. The last radio transmissions, the sudden silence, the faint signals caught just before everything stopped. The truth remained elusive, tangled in shadow and silence. What really happened that day in the Hollow Creek mine? No one knows, and maybe that's the part that haunts the town most of all. Years after the mine's closure and the official investigation ended, a discovery surfaced that reignited the mystery of Hollow Creek. It came in the form of an old, dust-covered logbook found buried deep in the records room of the mining company's headquarters, a place few had bothered to check since the disappearance. The logbook was not part of the formal daily records. It was a personal journal kept by one of the junior engineers who worked on the mine's ventilation and communication systems. Its pages were filled with technical notes, maintenance reports, and occasional observations about strange incidents. But as the entries progressed toward February 1982, the tone shifted. The engineer wrote of equipment malfunctions that defied explanation, radios that lost signal for minutes at a time, ventilation fans that stopped without power failure, and mysterious vibrations shaking the tunnels. What caught attention was a series of cryptic notes about a low hum heard underground and shadows in the periphery recorded by workers. Most chilling was an entry dated just days before the last shift. There's something in the tunnels. I don't know what it is, but the crew is scared. They say the mountain itself is alive, watching us. We're being tested. I'm not sure how much longer the systems will hold. If this goes wrong, it won't be an accident. The journal ended abruptly after that date. No final notes, no explanation. This logbook threw the official story into question. Had the company been aware of growing fears and failing equipment, but kept it quiet to avoid panic or shutdown? Did someone know the danger and fail to act? The discovery sparked new investigations, interviews with surviving employees, and attempts to verify the engineer's claims. Yet just like before, answers remained frustratingly out of reach. Some questioned the journal's authenticity, while others saw it as proof that something unnatural lurked beneath the mountain. What's more, a few years later, a tape surfaced, recorded by one of the miners on that final shift, lost in evidence until recently uncovered. The recording was brief and mostly static, but faint voices whispered warnings, and for a fleeting moment, a voice seemed to plead, "Don't come down here, it's not what you think." The tape ended with a chilling silence. The logbook and tape didn't solve the mystery. Instead, they deepened it, pulling Hollow Creek's disappearance into darker, more uncertain territory. Whatever happened underground that day was more than a simple accident. It was a secret the mountain refused to give up easily. So here we are, back on the surface, where the cold mountain air holds tight to its secrets. Hollow Creek remains a place frozen in time, not just by snow and silence, but by the weight of everything that disappeared beneath the earth. What happened to those men? How did the mountain claim them so completely, leaving no trace except a few broken signals and whispered warnings? The logbook, the tape, they hint at something beyond the usual dangers of mining, something darker or stranger, but nothing concrete, nothing we can fully grasp. I keep thinking about that last moment, the fragile grip on a phone, the crackle of a voice trying to break through the silence. It's a moment frozen in uncertainty, a thread pulled too tight before it snapped. Hollow Creek's story isn't one of clear answers or neat resolutions. It's a reminder of how little control we sometimes have over the places we depend on, and how some mysteries resist explanation, no matter how deep we dig. Maybe the mountain still holds its watch, waiting for the next shift, the next group who steps into its shadow without knowing the price. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. As always, if you heard something, or if this story sparks something for you, hit the like, subscribe button, and share it with your friend. Until next time.